The UK pledges millions to help Ukraine buy Gripen, but when will they arrive? Let's find out. Every fighter jet gets designed against a specific threat. Most of them never actually meet it. They get built for a Cold War that eventually ends, a conflict that gets deterred, a scenario that stays theoretical for the aircraft's entire service life. Well, the Gripen was different from the day Saab drew the first blueprint. It was built explicitly, deliberately, to survive and fight in exactly one scenario: Russia crossing into Swedish airspace, dispersed basing on ordinary roads because Soviet strikes were expected to destroy conventional airfields, 10-minute turnaround times because a NATO-style logistics tail wasn't going to be available. Every design decision traces back to one adversary that Sweden spent 4 decades preparing to face and never did. Now, on July 16th, in Kyiv, on his final visit as British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer announced £300 million to help field a squadron of 16 of these jets for Ukraine. The Gripen is finally getting the fight it was built for, just not over Sweden. Hey friends, Wes here, defense journalist, Army and Air Force veteran, law grad, and forever banned from the city of Bristol because of a Navy joke I made there once. Gee, a little touchy about your maritime traditions, aren't we, Your Majesty?
We shall defend our island, no matter the cost.
Today, we're covering the UK's Gripen funding announcement, what the Gripen E actually brings to Ukraine's air war, why the headline number is smaller than the real cost of the program, and why the timing of this announcement matters as much as the substance. Here's the big thing worth understanding before the hardware. Most Western aircraft going to Ukraine were designed for a different fight entirely. The F-16 was built for NATO's Central European air battle against the Warsaw Pact, with the assumption of established air bases, deep NATO logistics, and coalition air superiority already partially secured. Excellent aircraft, wrong original design brief for what Ukraine actually needs. Now, the Gripen design brief is Ukraine's exact situation, decades before anyone imagined a European nation would need it that way in real time. Dispersed operations because your air bases will get hit, minimal maintenance footprint because you don't have NATO's logistics tail, fast turnaround because every minute on the ground, under contested skies, is a minute you might not get airborne again. Sweden built an aircraft for a war against Russia that never came to Swedish soil. Ukraine is now buying that aircraft to fight the war that did come to a different country, using exactly the same doctrine Sweden spent 40 years developing. And let me be precise about this announcement because the coverage has been slightly imprecise about the numbers. Starmer announced £300 million, roughly $405 million, to help fund Ukraine's acquisition of 16 Gripen E fighters. This came during his final visit to Kyiv as UK Prime Minister, part of a broader relationship in which the UK has provided £3 billion in annual military support and, over Starmer's tenure, delivered over 250,000 drones, roughly 8,000 missiles, and more than 350,000 artillery rounds. The underlying contract signed between Ukraine and Sweden's Defense Material Administration on June 30th covers 16 new-build Gripen E fighters at a total value of about 24.6 billion Swedish kroner, somewhere in the range of 2.2 to 2.6 billion depending on the source and the exchange rate. But Britain's £300 million contribution is funding a portion of that total, alongside European Union credit support and the broader Ukrainian-Swedish financing arrangement. It also covers pilot training, engineer training, simulators, spare parts, and the infrastructure needed to actually operate the aircraft once delivered. And there's a second separate track worth noting. Sweden has also committed to donating up to 16 older CD aircraft directly as military aid rather than a purchase, with training for Ukrainian personnel beginning this year and first deliveries as early as 2027. That's coming soon. Combined with the 16 new-build E-model jets targeted for 2029, Ukrainian-Swedish agreements could eventually cover up to 32 Gripen aircraft across 2 generations. Now, Britain's £300 million also isn't purely altruistic, and the UK government isn't pretending otherwise. The program is projected to support approximately 5,000 skilled jobs across more than 50 UK-based companies in the supply chain, From Saab UK and Fareham to Leonardo UK and Edinburgh, this is defense industrial policy wearing a Ukraine support jacket, and both things can be true simultaneously. And here's what the aircraft itself contributes, because the platform genuinely matters for this specific fight. The Gripen E carries the Raven ES-05 ESA radar, an active, electronically scanned array system that represents a real generational leap over the mechanically scanned radars on most fourth-generation fighters still flying in this war. Paired with the Skyward G infrared search and track sensor and a really capable electronic warfare suite, the Gripen E is built to detect, identify, and engage threats while managing its own electromagnetic signature very carefully. Now, the weapon that matters most is the Meteor, and we've talked about it before on my channel. It's a ramjet-powered beyond visual range missile, roughly 3.65 meters long, weighing about 185 kilograms, traveling near a face-melting Mach 4 with an estimated range exceeding 100 miles depending on launch altitude and geometry. Unlike a conventional rocket motor missile that burns its propellant early and coasts on over to its target, the ramjet sustains thrust through most of the flight, which means the missile retains energy and maneuverability deep into what pilots call the no-escape zone. That's the range band where a target aircraft physically cannot outrun or outturn the incoming shot, regardless of what it does. The Gripen E can carry up to 7 Meteors simultaneously, alongside 2 Iris-T short-range missiles for close encounters of a first kind. 10 hardpoints total, sub-10-minute rearm and refuel turnaround with a reduced ground crew by design, because that's what road strip dispersed operations require. Now, the aircraft is rated to operate from stretches of highway as narrow as 16 meters and as short as 500 meters, a doctrine known in Sweden as BAS-90, developed specifically around the assumption that conventional airfields would be early targets in any Russian attack. Now, that connects directly to what Ukraine's Air Force has needed since 2022. Fixed air bases are exactly what Russia has spent the war trying to locate and destroy. An aircraft designed from its earliest specifications to disperse onto ordinary roads and fight from there is not an incidental feature for Ukraine. It's close to the single most relevant design characteristic in the entire package. Now, I want to explain why the Meteor's no-escape zone matters so much in this specific matchup, because it's a kill chain problem, not just really a missile spec sheet. Russia's Su-35s carry a really powerful radar, the Irbis E, with more raw detection range than the Gripen CD. With more raw detection range than the Gripen CD's older PS-05A system. On paper, in a straight sensor comparison, that favors Russia. Well, Russian pilots would likely get a radar return on an older Gripen before the Gripen gets one on them. Similar to the dynamic we've seen play out between Ukraine's F-16 fleet against the same Russian aircraft. But the Meteor changes that calculation independent of who sees who first. It's a jamming-resistant active radar seeker with a two-way data link, which means the launching aircraft can update the missile's targeting mid-flight, including with data fed from other platforms entirely. Combined with a home-on jam mode, meaning the missile can guide towards the source of enemy jamming if the target tries to break lock electronically, the Meteor gives even a radar disadvantaged Gripen pilot a credible shot in scenarios where older missiles would have already lost the target. That's the lesson from every kill chain story I've covered from this war. The platform with the better single sensor doesn't automatically win. The platform embedded in the better network with the weapon that degrades gracefully under jamming rather than failing outright closes that sensor gap. The Meteor is specifically built to do that. Now, I should note that the Gripen has never fought the adversary it was built for. Sweden invested for decades and a substantial share of its defense budget designing an aircraft around a specific threat of Russian aggression. And that scenario simply never arrived on Swedish soil. Lieutenant Colonel Johan Hoiven, a lecturer at the Swedish Defense University, put it pretty bluntly. Ukraine represents a test against the system this aircraft was actually designed to face. A test, in his words, of Swedish technology itself. That's a really strange position for a NATO-adjacent defense industry to be in. Everything about the Gripen's design philosophy, the road basing doctrine, the low logistics footprint, the emphasis on network integration over individual platform superiority, gets validated or exposed by how it performs in Ukrainian skies, not Swedish ones. Now, Ukraine gets a purpose-built aircraft, Sweden gets combat data on a weapon system it's fielded for years without ever using it against the adversary it was designed to counter. Both outcomes matter, and neither country is being shy about acknowledging it. And here's the answer to the question everybody actually watching this cares about. When do these things show up in Ukraine? Well, there are two separate tracks moving on two separate clocks, and conflating them together is where most of the coverage gets confusing. Track 1, the donation. Sweden has committed to giving Ukraine up to 16 older CD aircraft directly from its existing fleet. No purchase required. It's going to be outright military aid. This is the fastest track by a wide margin. Now, training for Ukrainian pilots and technical personnel is beginning this year, with the first aircraft arriving in Ukrainian service by early 2027. Track 2 is the purchase, the 16 new-build Gripen E aircraft, the ones Britain's £300 million is helping fund. Those are on a considerably longer clock. The contract was signed June 30th. Saab hasn't built these jets yet. Production and delivery are targeted for 2029 to 2030, with Ukraine hoping to receive its first E-model aircraft in early 2029. Yes, you heard me right, 2029. Building a fighter jet from a standing contract start takes years even under ideal conditions, and Saab is producing these alongside existing orders from Sweden, Brazil, maybe Canada, and other customers already in the production queue. So the realistic timeline is older donated Gripen CD jets arriving in maybe as early as 6 months, with the newer, more capable Gripen E following no earlier than 2029. Now, three things could move those dates in either direction, and it's worth talking about them real quick. First, training. Flying a Gripen isn't like converting a MiG-29 pilot to an F-16 with a few months of transition work. It's a different avionics philosophy, a different sensor fusion approach, a different weapons employment doctrine. Ukraine's F-16 training pipeline took longer than initially projected when that program started, and there's no strong reason to assume Gripen training moves faster, especially for the more complex E model. Second, production queue priority. Saab is a Swedish company building for Swedish, Brazilian, Canadian, maybe now Ukrainian orders simultaneously. Whether Ukraine's jet gets prioritized ahead of schedule, delayed behind other customers, or held to the announcement timeline depends on decisions inside Saab's production planning that aren't fully visible from outside the company. Unless, Saab, you want to call me and let me know. Third, and this is the one nobody likes saying out loud, the war's trajectory between now and 2029. A contract signed in the middle of an active war is a bet on where that war stands years from now. If the front stabilizes or shifts dramatically, delivery priorities, funding commitments, and even the strategic rationale for the purchase could all be revisited by whichever governments are in power in London, Stockholm, and Kyiv by then. Now, Starmer notably signed this as one of his final acts before leaving office. The commitment is real. Whether every government that touches this contract between now and 2029 maintains the same priority is a real unknown. And the honest, short version for anyone asking when Ukrainian pilots actually sit in a Gripen cockpit and go into combat, well, let's watch the CD donation training milestones over the next 6 months. That's the real near-term signal. The E-model squadron is a 2029 story, and a lot can happen in a war between now and then. Okay, so here's what the announcement represents beyond the specific aircraft and the specific funding figure. Every Western nation that built serious military hardware during the Cold War designed some of it around a Russian scenario that then spent 30 years looking theoretical. Sweden built the Gripen around exactly that scenario and kept refining it for decades after most of Europe had stopped seriously planning for it, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, everybody assumed it's the end of history. But Sweden kept working on the Russia problem even after the Soviets fell. To a lot of people, that looked like defense conservatism bordering on unnecessary caution. It now looks like foresight. Ukraine is buying 40 years of Swedish institutional paranoia about a specific threat, crystallized into a weapons platform that happens to match Ukraine's operational reality almost exactly. Contested airspace, threatened fixed infrastructure, a need to fight dispersed and mobile rather than concentrated and vulnerable. Britain's £300 million isn't funding a generic fighter jet purchase. It is funding the transfer of a very specific, very deliberate design philosophy from the country that built it under threat to the country actually living that threat in real time. That's a different kind of value than the euro figure captures. The funding gap between announced commitments and total contract value hasn't been publicly resolved. The 2029 delivery timeline for the new build aircraft sits years into an uncertain war, and the earlier CD donation track, while faster, still depends on training and infrastructure that hasn't been built yet. Still, I, for one, can't wait to see what these Gripens do in Ukrainian hands. That's it for today, my friends. If this was useful, and only if I've earned your trust, please hit that thumbs up button and consider subscribing. It is the best free way to support what I do here. I cover NATO, Ukraine, and military technology 4 times a week. For deeper written analysis, I do write on Medium and Substack. Check me out there or just wesodonald.com. And as always, glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes. Crimea is Ukraine.